Morning, everybody. My name is Max Halverson. I'm really excited to share with you today my work on educational opportunities and gaps for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students. I'm coming to you today from Seattle. My wife is 38 weeks pregnant, so I decided I would prioritize my marriage and happy to be sharing with you remotely today. So this work is on educational opportunity gaps. We put together two reports, one on Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander youth and one on Asian American youth. And I'm just sharing on behalf of myself and my lead co-authors, Jen Nguyen and Santino Camacho. Uh, I'm Max Halverson. I'm a research scientist with the School of Social Work in the Social Development Research Group. Um, and I want to say a couple things about sort of my identities and how I came to this work. One is identify as Native Hawaiian or Kanaka Maoli and Chinese. I'm multiracial. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist here. And my wife pointed out recently that I'm actually the only clinical psychologist that I've ever met that's Native Hawaiian. So when you come into work like this that's related to your personal identities, of course, you come to it a little differently. And the other little piece of information I'll share is I have a daughter who's almost 2 and a son on the way, and they're going to grow up in this educational system, sort of navigating it as youth with these intersecting identities of being Native Hawaiian and multiracial. And sort of selfishly want to make sure I can understand that and contribute in some way to building that system. So this project was a joint effort from between the College of Education here at University of Washington and the School of Social Work, and was actually commissioned by the Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs, which is a group that reports to the governor and gives recommendations on Asian and Pacific American affairs. And as you'll see from this slide, we came to this study with a lot of lived experience and as members of this community, and navigated these dual roles as researchers and community members throughout. And sort of to that end, we created a set of principles to guide our work. So this is really merging together ideas from community-based participatory research, as well as values from our communities, our Asian American, as well as our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities. I'll just talk briefly about these core principles of responsibility and reciprocity. So first, we have responsibility to our communities to care for, honor, and share their stories as cherished gifts of knowledge, and also to treat the relationship of research as relationship building rather than as a transactional process. And this guided our research design as well. So partly because of this, wanting to understand what's going on in communities, we took a mixed methods approach, and we also had a CAB, or a community advisory board, that guided us through this process. So not only did we look at quantitative data sources, but we also interviewed both educators who were educators and administrators and youth from our communities in order to understand what's going on with them, what's their lived experience on the ground, how do our findings fit into this broader context. And also our community advisory board, which consisted of leaders in education, of community leaders, of people who work directly in social services, in order to understand and contextualize our findings. And they really guided our work to not just be our sort of academic findings, but really to be related to policies that we could put in action. So we did interview educators, administrators, and youth across the state. And this map shows where they were distributed. As you can see, most of our participants were concentrated in the Western Washington area around Puget Sound. So this is Seattle, Tacoma, Bellevue, up to Everett, and other communities. But there's also population centers out in Eastern Washington, Spokane, and Southern Washington in Clark County, which is Vancouver, Washington. And we wanted to really explore what people's experiences were all across the state. I'll briefly also just share what our quantitative data sources were. So, many evaluations would start and end here, looking at these metrics across school records, connecting these with post-secondary data, which is this Washington Education Research and Data Center enables this. But we also in Washington State have a biannual survey that occurs on the off years of standardized testing for middle and high school students that can get into more topics such as socioeconomic status, language, disability, and well-being to kind of flesh out that picture. And we also looked at population data from AAPI data and the US Census. So one thing I want to convince you of by the end of this talk is that grouping AAPI data together or sort of aggregating data is misleading, and it's a practice that we have to sort of push on over time. So I'll give an example. So percentage of students speaking languages other than English at home, about 36% or 1 in 3 of Asian and Asian American families are speaking another language at home, whereas only about 1 in 5 of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander families are doing so. And this is a big difference, right? 15% percentage points. But if we were to aggregate these folks together, we would see basically this bar disappears and we see something like this 36% because of the way the numbers work out. But this isn't helpful when you're trying to decide what sort of policies to put in place. I also want to argue that we can take this a step further and look within the Asian American umbrella and this Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander umbrella at what's going on. So over half, if we look at Indian Punjabi students, and we get to this more granular ethnicity level, are speaking language other than English at home, compared to say 16% for Filipino or 20% for Japanese. And these are communities that have been here in Washington longer. But on the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander side, it's maybe even more dramatic, where we see 82% of our Marshallese students from the Marshall Islands, are speaking a language other than English at home. And this is very actionable, tangible. We can make sure we recruit more translators. We can make sure we do outreach events within our school districts and schools to engage community in the education. So one of the sort of big findings of our report is really in the breadth of the topics that we found to be relevant when we think about educational opportunities and gaps. So I'll share these at a high level, but then I'll sort of zoom in on a couple for the purpose of this talk. The first is describing our population a little bit. The second is what I just described a little bit. How do we think about data and how data can drive equitable policy? Sections 3 and 4 are really about academic achievement. Section 5 is really about well-being, but how belonging and connection and representation really are intimately linked. Number 6, how can we infuse NHPI cultures and histories into K-12 education? This is something we heard a lot from our community advisory board, from our interviewees, and it was really put forward as a solution, as a way to fill gaps. And finally, how can we uplift educator representation and develop cultural humility? There's, of course, an educator shortage in underrepresented groups more broadly, and this is even more true in our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander population. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about what NHPI youth are like here in Washington. Here are some pictures of our youth, pretty recent ones. And it gives you a sense of just, how are youth living their lives? Are they, experiencing the same things? And if you look at these pictures, they're kids, right? They're kids living in the United States. They're engaging in some activities related to their home cultures. They're also related in activities of just being a kid, right? We're sort of complex people and bringing in this multiple identities into our ways of being. And the NHPI population here in Washington is actually the fastest growing population. So these light blue bars represent population growth in Washington specifically, and the dark blue nationwide. And there's been about 60% growth from 2010 to 2020 in the Washington Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population. And actually, if you look from around 2008, when the first report version of this report was done, to now, it's almost quadrupled. Really big population growth. If you look nationwide, we're in Washington the number 3 in the NHPI population by size after Hawaii and California. And actually, we're overrepresented here in Washington in the sense that nationwide, is about 0.5% of people who identify as an NHPI, but in Washington, it's about 1.5% of the total population. Important thing to know, especially in light of kind of the current climate, is that NHPI have these diverse citizenship statuses and experiences of how these citizenship statuses came to be. Often these are really tied to colonization by Western powers and how that's affected the population, immigration patterns. But kind of specifically and tangibly, that means kids and families have different citizenship statuses. They might be a full citizen. Myself, I'm from Hawaii, and we have full citizenship status because of the status of Hawaii as a state. There's also U.S. national status. There's the COFA, or Compact of Free Association, that guides certain relations and benefits for folks living here. And there are also immigrants from sovereign nations, right? And these all create different sort of abilities to access services. Another thing to know about our NHPI population is that intersectionality is a huge part of how people think about their identities, right? We don't want to think about the NHPI or Pacifica population here in Washington as a monolith. And specifically, these intersecting identities that came up with respect to education, one is disability, one is multiracial identity. So in our health use survey data from 2023, about 60% of our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander youth are identifying as more than one race, which is massive, right? We really have to consider that. And then lastly, gender and sexual identity, which is really important in this population specifically. So first, I want to share with you a little bit of data on educational achievement, and not to linger on it too long, but to give a sense of what's going on for our youth. These data can't necessarily tell us how to fix problems, but we have to face them and sit with them when we decide, what to address in the scope. So if we look at high school GPAs across the state, we can see that NHPI youth are facing significant challenges, right? The median or minimum passing GPA is 2.0, and we see median GPAs that are even below this line or are close to it, right? So many of our students are experiencing opportunity gaps or experiencing the education system in a way that's not, leading to success. And again, we have to sort of sit with this for a second, right? It's sobering data, it's important to understand, and it's pretty reflective of challenges. And one thing that was important in this work was to not just see youth as their grades, but also to understand what's going on with them more broadly. So looking at this health use survey data and talking to students, we can get a better sense of what challenges they're facing and how they're sort of doing mentally and emotionally. So one theme that came up early and consistently was that NHPI students feel undervalued or less visible than their peers at school. So they can experience disconnectedness and social exclusion, and really that can affect their investment in school. So one educator put it this way: our district has this goal of increasing sense of belonging. I don't think sense of belonging can truly happen when we don't start to be very intentional about the spaces that we're in and creating these spaces which are familiar and helpful to our students. And this belonging is reflected in how youth are faring emotionally. So actually, among our statewide population, about 40% of NHPI students reported feeling depressed in the past year, and this is highest among all racial groups. This is not something we expected. There isn't much data out there on Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander youth well-being. And it's, again, sobering. It's important to understand, and it's kind of hard to look at. And this is also reflected in thoughts of suicide. So about 1 in 5 of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander youth reported having thoughts of suicide at least once in the past year. And this is the highest among all racial groups as well. Just to give a sense of this intersectionality piece that I've talked about earlier, we also looked at mental health by gender amongst NHPI students, and we found that both female identifying students, and then students who identified as transgender were more likely to have mental health issues, and especially students who are transgender, just having extremely high rates of mental health challenges. So again, I talked about sort of some of these data are pointing towards the challenges, and often what we heard, the value of qualitative data is you can also hear ideas for solutions or pointing towards the issues that we can solve. So one idea that came up over and over again was this idea is, first of all, culture as prevention, that culture can be a way to engage youth in their identities and to have them bond to these environments where they can invest. So Pacific students often don't see their cultures, identities, histories, or practices represented in here, our US curriculum. And one Marshallese student said, you want to feel included and represented. We mostly hear about bad events, but I also want to learn how we came together as people, how we survived and thrived. And one way to think about this is if you think about youth and what they learn in school, if they do learn anything about their home countries where their parents are from or their ancestors, the thing they learned is either when their home country was used for nuclear testing or bomb testing by the United States government, or when their country or their sovereign nation was illegally overthrown or annexed or colonized again by a Western power. And these are not positive stories that kids are hearing about themselves. And one way that communities have come together to work on this and deal with that is to sort of bring in their own sense of what is the knowledge that we have as people? What are our practices that we can celebrate and engage with? And so cultural education, um, there's evidence that it helps to promote belonging, positive self-image, engagement in schools, mental well-being, and even healing from this historical trauma, all of these difficult things our families have had to go through to get to this point. There are existing programs that have started to show success in doing this here in Washington. So one is the Mana Youth Program, which is run by Utopia Washington. Utopia Washington is a queer and trans-Pacific Islander-led organization, and they've created cultural dance programs. They've created tutoring programs, work directly with youth and by embedding in schools. And there's actually ongoing research by some of my colleagues to understand how does this impact student outcomes and how youth really understand and engage with these programs. Here in one of our sort of more rural school districts in Enumclaw, our community has worked with the American Indian Alaska Native community here to put together this canoe journey curriculum and work through it with kids. So kids get to learn about not just, school, classroom-based topics, but they get to learn about math, science, ecology, the environment through the metaphor of the canoe journey and also getting out and working and understanding their own cultural practices. So some of this has started to be applied to Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander youth who have some similar overlap in cultural values. And this third program is a similar vein. So in Eastern Washington, the Marshallese population there, I showed you on the first slide or early slide that many of them don't speak English at home and are less acclimated or less acculturated here than others. They've put together the community this Marshallese Culture and Language program that's being used for course credit towards graduation. It's teaching language requirements. It's teaching math and science, teaching history. And this has been, again, through partnership with the school district and this mechanism at the top, which is called mastery-based learning. There's a mechanism in place to acknowledge this type of learning as meeting graduation requirements and, of course, as important to developing as youth. So I'll briefly show this, and we don't need to linger. This is really for educators, but one of the outcomes of this study was to generate recommendations for educators, for administrators, on how we can shrink these gaps and what schools can do. And I just wanted to put this up here. I don't want to, again, linger too much because for this audience, this isn't the main point, but this was one of our big products. I do want to close on educational dreams. So youth told us what they wanted from their lives. Educators told us what they wanted for their youth. And this is really what it's all about, right? Why do we do this work? So one of our youth said, I've been wanting to be a teacher. I've never seen a Marshallese teacher. It influences me because I could start something. And one of our educators shared, working harder to make money is not the end goal. It's the other things that feel important. How are you in community with each other and with yourself? And what are the things you need to do to learn in order to do that? And what are the ways in which we need to think about our planet and non-human parts of how we interact with the world? I wonder if we were in a place that with more of the aligned values, how our Pacific Islander students and families would show up differently and what success would look like. Thank you.